Hello everyone, it's Karen at the Cool Tool Studio. Today I'm going to be demonstrating how you can set any shape stone using Syringe metal clay. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through this really simple pendant just to demonstrate how to go about making this style of setting. It's a really simple, straightforward method of setting, and like I said before, it can work with any shape of stone. So I think it'll be a really fun project, and let's get started by looking at what materials we need. For today's project, you're going to need a clay board, a tissue blade, some tough cards, a disposable applicator brush, an ultra clay pick, a brush for applying water, and then these are just kind of optional but helpful for creating the azure behind your stone, either a stone setting punch or a bezel setting template that would correspond to the shape of the stone that you're setting. Again, you can use any shape stone for this project. Today I'm working with this little pear CZ. You're also going to need some sanding pads and then a texture of your choice, a snake maker, clay thickness rolling frames, a wander roller, and some cool slip. Today I'm working with Phoenix Torch Fireable Clay and Phoenix Torch Fireable Clay Syringe. And then you need some sort of template for the perimeter of your pendant. I'm working with this Cindy Pope template. It's kind of a teardrop shape. I like that it kind of corresponds with the pear shape of my stone. And you're also going to need a mask for protecting yourself while you sand. So I am working with Phoenix Torch Fireable Clay today, and if you've worked with Easy 960 or FS 999 before, it's a little bit different in that it helps to condition it to soften it some, especially if you're wanting to stay kind of board flat while you're working. And with this style of setting, that's going to be important. So I am going to condition the clay a little bit. And when I'm conditioning the clay, I don't use cool slip because it doesn't stick to the work surface or the roller. And if I can avoid folding unnecessary additives into my clay, then I will. So what I'm doing here to condition my clay is I'm just kind of rolling and folding, rotating, and doing this a couple of times. And then I'm going to take it into my fingers and knead it a little bit. And you can just feel kind of texturally that this is getting softer. I do have some gloves in a bottle on my fingers to prevent me from drawing too much moisture out of the clay as I'm working. And if you're working in a particularly dry environment, you might find that as you're doing this, it could be helpful to dip into a little bit of water and add some moisture back in, especially if you've got very dry hands. Even with the gloves in the bottle, you could potentially kind of dry things out in this process. But I would consider this at this point conditioned. So now I'm going to start rolling for my project. And I'm rolling to 4 cards thickness here. And I'm going to be texturing down to 3 cards. And at this point, I am going to go ahead and use some cool slip on my texture. And that's just going to prevent the clay from sticking in all those low recesses. So here I've got my texture, and then at this point I'm going to move on to a tough card to protect this work surface here. And at this point, it's kind of up to you. I find that I personally like to kind of pick the size with my stone prior to going ahead and making a cut. So, I mean, you could do something big with a lot of extra play on the side to kind of play around with, but for this project I think I'm going to get it kind of close to the edge like I did on this piece. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out my pendant shape here. I've got my ultra clay pick, and you just drag it along the edge. And whenever I'm cutting a shape that has a sharp point like that, I cut into the point, because trying to round that out is going to kind of soften that point and that edge. So at this point I'm going to remove all my excess clay, and take it off to my hydrator. Because it is kind of a dry environment where I'm working, again, this is just something I've kind of found that helps keep this clay workable and happy. I'll just put some water on the surface really fast and kind of fold it. And then I'll put this into my baggie and then back into my clay hydrator. So now we're ready to look at setting our stone. Again, you could use a bezel template. I'm working with one of these stone setting punches just because it's, for me, really convenient to kind of eye and figure out about where it should go. If you do accidentally set it like a little too far to one side, you can always sand and correct things. But you're going to try to eyeball around the middle here. I'm going to kind of tentatively push, kind of look at it, see how it looks. I think that'll be good. I'm just going to punch to remove that material. So I did that because when you're setting stones, you want a hole to be behind the stone so light can come through to really maximize the sparkle of your stone. So I'm going to really quickly set this off to the side, and I'm going to figure out how tall my stone is. And I'm going to do this because with this type of setting, I'll go ahead and bring another example up. Since it is kind of organic and we're using syringe and it's soft, it could potentially be easy to put your stone in at an angle. And I mean, depending on what look you're going for, that might not be the end of the world. But if you do want your stone set nice and flat, we're going to use a snake maker alongside some thickness rolling frames to apply pressure to the top of the stone and make sure that it sets nice and flat. So to do that, we're going to figure out how tall our setting should be. So this is a good old Lizelle Crowley technique where you use the thickness frames and you stack them up, and then you drag the snake maker over the top of your stone and you're looking for it to not move. So let's say I get rid of the 3 cards. Oh, it's moving. That's not a deep enough setting. So I went ahead and measured this one before we started filming, and I know that this is what I'm looking for here. So I know that when I'm ready to set the stone, I've got my thickness already predetermined over here. All right, so at this point we're going to bring in the syringe, get the excess off the tip there, and get setting. So this is a pretty straightforward way of setting. I feel like every time I set a stone in metal clay, it always ends up looking kind of the same. It's a bezel or a bezel with prongs, and I just wanted to try something a little bit different. And I've seen people use syringe on settings before, but I wanted to do something where you're not really working against the syringe, like you're not having to clean it up and try to tidy up a material that by nature is kind of loose and fluid. I wanted to take advantage of that in this setting. So I'm putting a little bit of moisture on my clay to make it kind of ready to accept the syringe that I'm putting on top of it. And I've got the medium tip syringe that came with this package here on my clay. And I'm just going to run some material around this edge. And I'm going to kind of do 2 trips around, and that's going to give me enough material to kind of set and let it kind of squish around where it needs to be. So at this point, I'm just going to drop my stone in, and you might have to do some nudging and adjusting with a brush. Kind of I'm paying attention to this point and kind of looking at that point and seeing if they're, facing the same direction. So again, at this point, it'd be kind of hard to use my finger to push this down and make sure it's sitting nice and flat. So I've got my determined stack here of how tall my stone is, and obviously there's some material underneath my stone as well, propping it up, and then there's also the additional material of this platform for my pendant that it's sitting on too. So you can take some away. I'm going to try going down 3 and see if that's enough, and if not, I'll swap out for 4. But I'm just looking to use this nice flat face supported by these frames to make sure that I'm going to be pushing my stone in nice and flat. So there, it kind of squished down, but not as much as I might like. So I'm going to swap it out, the 4 for a 3, and give it another squish. At this point he twisted some, so I'm going to nudge him back into position. Try that again. All right. So now at this point, there's some spots where my syringe wasn't high enough on my point here that I'm going to actually come back in and apply a little bit more material below. And you don't have to worry about this getting too messy. You can clean things up with a brush, and then because of the way that we're going to be adding the kind of granulation style dots around afterwards, there's plenty of opportunity to mask or clean up any more kind of messy looking or loose looking syringe. But I'm just kind of blending that out and filling in where I need to. So I've been doing a good bit of nudging, so I'm just going to one more time use these frames and push down to make sure we're sitting flat. All right, so at this point I find that it's helpful to let this dry. That way when you're adding and building up the dots in the detail here, you're not risking potentially bumping or again kind of skewing your nice setting there. So we're going to take this off to dry. So while my pendant dries, I'm going to go ahead and make the bail. And for this project, I just kind of like a simple hidden bail on the back, but you can obviously do whatever you want. But if you are kind of following along with me, I'm just using this disposable applicator. This is a perfect little mandrel to kind of form these little tubes around. So I'm going to be rolling some clay to form that. And for something like this, 2 cards thickness is going to be fine. It's a small shape that I'm making, and it's round, and it's going to be a nice strong shape, so it doesn't need to be crazy thick. So for something like this, I'll usually start off with a tissue blade and just make 1 cut. And then I'll kind of clean up my sides too. And then I'll get it loosened up from the tough card. And I'll start kind of curling it around this applicator here. And this is enough to make tons. As I'm making them, I usually go ahead and make lots that I just kind of keep on hand. I'm applying some water to get it to stick as I'm rolling. And then once it's kind of connecting, I'm going to use my brush to kind of coax it under. And then I'm going to come in and cut off my excess. So at this point you can kind of roll to pick it up, and then go back and forth and kind of smooth and close this. This would be the part that I would put against my pendant. Anyways, like this seam's going to go back against there, so I'll add extra material when I'm connecting it to my pendant itself, so you don't really have to spend too much time on this. But just to keep it in one piece while it's drying, I'm going to go ahead and close it up. this will be plenty of bales for lots of projects. And at this point, I'm just going to leave it alone and let it dry. So at this point, this is dry enough that I'm ready to move on. And this is where it gets kind of fun and kind of creative. You can kind of decide how much you want to bring the material up and over your stone, and if you want to kind of drag it out to the edge of your pendant. And I don't really plan too much, I just kind of start doing and see what looks good and kind of make additions as needed. But I start off again with this medium tip. If you're doing a bigger pendant or maybe a bigger stone, you might want to bump up to the biggest. But I'm just kind of starting to build up some dots. And I'm starting on the syringe itself, this base layer that I already did, and then coming up on top of my stone. So right now I'm just kind of working the whole edge, and putting some material down, and now I'm going to come up and start adding some to the top. And I'll usually kind of dry and let it kind of settle and dry in between layers to kind of get an idea of how things are looking. So this is kind of just like the first go at it. And I'm going to bring some off to the side over here. And then kind of follow it down over here. And then at this point, before I go ahead and add some more, I'm going to let it dry just because it's kind of hard to add the syringe to something soft. Like if I'm trying to add smaller little dots on top of these bigger dots while they're still soft, I could kind of end up squishing them and pushing them down. They do kind of have like a little bit of a point to them. I usually actually kind of leave that because as it does dry and settle a little bit, that kind of helps it keep a little bit of contrast and shape to it. So once again, we're off to dry. So this first layer of syringe has dried, and that's just going to make it easier to kind of continue to build the little dots and the interest without kind of squishing the layer ahead of it. So at this point, I am going to go ahead and just add a little bit of water to let that soak in to that syringe, just to make it a little more receptive of the syringe that I'm going to be adding to it. And just like before, I'm starting off with my medium and just kind of adding dots where I think it's needed. You do want to make sure that you do come up over and onto the face of your stone a little bit here to make it nice and secure. Like you want to make sure you're not just building below the stone, so when it shrinks it's not going to pop out. So I'm going to put one dot here over that edge. And kind of make that kind of a grouping that's coming up and over. Put one down here again. Kind of bigger one there. And this is just kind of a fun process. You just kind of, again, play with it as you go. And kind of see what looks good. And kind of for the balance sake, might be nice to put some over here, up and over this edge. And then at this point, I'm going to switch to the smaller tip and do some smaller dots. Make sure I don't distort things as I pick it up. I always kind of like to get it started on a tough card so there aren't surprises. There it is. I'm just going to do some little dots along this edge, and then just kind of break up all the bigger dots. Just kind of add a little more visual interest and make it a little more textural by adding these smaller dots as well. A little variety. And that's more or less just basically it. You could dry this again and then kind of take a look and see if you want to add more. But I feel like I can kind of get the look that I'm going for in just the initial dry and then extra layer. All right, so I'm going to let that dry and we're going to revisit our bale. So again, I didn't really spend much time securing the seam, and as it shrunk, it kind of pulled a little bit there, but that's fine because that's where I'm going to connect it to my pendant anyways. And when I go to kind of cut these to size, I'll leave them on this, whatever you formed it on. Again, I used this disposable applicator, and I'll just use my tissue blade and push down and just kind of roll. And that'll cut off. That was a little thin, maybe. A little thin for this project, but I could use it on another. Clean up that edge. Do another one. And it's just a really quick and easy way to make a bunch of little hidden bales. So again, I'm just kind of pushing down with my tissue blade and then just rolling my applicator and kind of following it to cut these little tubes. So I'm going to save these for putting onto my pendant once it's dry. At this point, my piece is dry and I'm ready to do a little bit of refinement. Just because of the kind of organic nature of this project, there isn't really a ton of cleanup I do have to do. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time kind of smoothing out this cut edge, and for that I'm just going to use my ultrafine sanding pad. At this point I do have a mask on to protect myself from any dust particles, but I'm just kind of softening that edge there a little bit, and that's kind of pointy. I'm just going to round that out just a touch. I want it to be comfortable to the wearer. And that'll do it. So at this point I'm ready to attach my bale. So I'm flipping my piece over, and then I went ahead and put the medium tip back on my syringe. And I'm going to pick one and kind of position it, make sure it's not too wide. This one, if I put it right there, it's low enough that it's not going to hang up, but if I hung it too high there, you'd flip it over and it'd be hanging over your edge. So just make sure that you're picking one that is of an appropriate thickness that you're not going to see from the front. If I did want it higher up, I could use this thinner one here. So I'll go ahead and show that. So I've got a brush here that I'm dampening, and then since this piece has been thoroughly dry, I want this to be a nice strong connection, I'm going to go ahead and wet this, and I'm actually going to let it kind of soak in a little bit. So I'm going to wet it once and give it a minute, and then I'm going to wet it again. So at this point I'm going to add a little bit more water. And with Phoenix clay for this connection, you have several options available to you. You could just use the lump clay. I do that very often for my connections with Phoenix, but since I've got the syringe handy here, that also makes a nice strong connection. So that's soaked in a little bit. One more time, some liquid, and then on the piece that I'm going to be joining as well, a little bit of water. Kind of soften that. And then I usually find it's easier to apply the syringe to the piece that I'm, like the smaller component, in this case the bale, that I'm joining to a larger piece. You could use tweezers for this, if you have them on hand. I'm just using my fingers. I'm just going to kind of set it. At this point it's a little crooked. You can nudge it with your hand or a brush, whatever's easier. And then I'm just going to quickly clean up some syringe that kind of came out around my edges. And at this point I'm going to allow it to dry before I do any additional cleanup. My connection is dry, and I'm just going to spend a little bit of time looking at it and seeing if there's any cleanup that I need to do. Mostly if I just need to shape either of these sides at all. Since I rough cut it with a tissue blade on this applicator brush here, it might not be kind of a perfect perpendicular, so you could use your super fine and just up and down to even out anything that you need to. And then to clean up any scratches that you made while shaping, you'd want to go from ultrafine to microfine. But this is looking okay. And then this is just optional. At this point, you could add some dots to the back, just for a little kind of corresponding interest that speaks to the front of the piece. And to do that, just like before, apply a little bit of water where you're thinking you're going to put them. And then come in with the syringe. This is also another opportunity if you had some that kind of came out from behind that you wanted to incorporate into your design. Make it a little less of a mistake and more of a, ooh, look at that nice detail. So one kind of breaking the edge, coming over here. Again, just kind of whatever flows and looks nice with your shapes. Now that everything's dry and I'm not going to disturb anything, before I fire this piece, I'm going to come in with some alcohol on this disposable brush that I was using earlier to form my bail on, and clean up any dust or silver or oil or anything that could cloud my stone on both the back and the front. This one's kind of tricky since there is kind of a rough edge that comes up over my stone. I'm just kind of pushing into to follow that perimeter. And then just a quick glance over the top of the stone. For firing this piece, since it does have this raised bail on the back, you'd want to either fire it in alumina hydrate or vermiculite in a dish, or alternately, if you have one of those softer ceramic fiber bricks, you can use a sharp tool to kind of carve a little groove that this could set into. As far as firing goes, I did work with Phoenix Torch Fireable Clay, but my stone is a little bit too large to be torch fired for this piece. But if you used a smaller stone, you could torch fire this piece, or you could use one of the recommended kiln firing schedules. I had a really good time with this project, and I really enjoyed kind of a more laid-back approach to stone setting. Usually stone setting is pretty technical and a little bit finicky, and this was just a really relaxing, laid-back process. I think it really contributes to the focal point of a stone, and I can't wait to see how you incorporate it in your pieces. I hope this video shows that you can play around with the methods that you use to set your stone, and I hope it inspires you to try something new. Thanks for watching.